The gravel crunched under the sheriff's cruiser tires as it rolled up fast to where I stood. A woman in a bright pink visor was already out of her car, pointing at me with the fury of someone who had just caught a criminal. Red-handed, her face was twisted with rage as she screamed that I was trespassing on private property. The two officers approached me cautiously, hands resting on their duty belts. The lead officer, a tall man with graying temples, spoke with authority. "Sir, we're going to need to see some identification. This lady says you don't belong here." I reached slowly for my wallet, keeping my movements deliberate and calm. "Officers, I own this land," I said, pulling out my driver's license along with another card. "And I'm Federal Judge Marcus Henderson." The transformation on their faces was immediate. The woman in the visor, who I would later learn was named Patricia Thornfield, but insisted everyone call her Patricia, not Pat or Patty, seemed to deflate slightly, but only for a moment. Her eyes narrowed as she processed this information, already calculating her next move. 3 weeks earlier, I had finally closed on the ranch I'd been dreaming about for years. 40 acres of beautiful Texas hill country butting up against the edge of rolling hills estates, an upscale subdivision known for having one of the most aggressive HOAs in the state. I'd heard the stories, of course, but my property wasn't part of their jurisdiction. I owned my land free and clear with no deed restrictions or covenants. I kept a low profile, only visiting once a month to check on the property and meet with the contractor who was slowly renovating the old farmhouse. But Patricia Thornfield had other ideas. As president of the Rolling Hills HOA for the past 7 years, she ruled her domain with an iron fist, wrapped in a velvet glove of faux politeness. The first time I encountered her, I was unloading some supplies from my truck when she marched across the property line in her trademark visor and clipboard. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that could cut glass. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Patricia Thornfield, president of the Rolling Hills Homeowners Association, and you are." I introduced myself simply as Marcus, explaining I'd recently purchased the ranch. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes scanned my property like a hawk, searching for prey. "Well, Marcus, I'm sure you'll want to bring this property up to our community's standards. That fence is looking rather shabby, and is that a livestock trailer? We have strict guidelines about commercial vehicles." I politely informed her that my property wasn't part of the HOA. The smile finally cracked. "Perhaps not officially," she said, with a tone that suggested she knew something I didn't, "but as neighbors we expect a certain level of cooperation. I'll send you our guidelines for reference." She spun on her heel and marched back to her pristine white Range Rover, leaving me to wonder what I'd gotten myself into. The harassment started small. Official-looking notices appeared taped to my gate, citing violations of codes that didn't apply to my property, complaints to the city about imaginary livestock noises, even though I hadn't brought any animals to the ranch. Yet then came the letters from the HOA's attorney suggesting that there might be confusion about my property boundaries, and that I should consider joining the HOA voluntarily to avoid any misunderstandings. I ignored it all, filing each document carefully in a folder marked Patricia's nonsense. But Patricia wasn't used to being ignored. One morning I arrived at my ranch to find a large metal gate had been installed across the access road, complete with a shiny new lock and a sign declaring it private HOA property. The problem was this was a public easement that had existed for over 50 years. I called the sheriff's department to report the illegal obstruction, but Patricia had anticipated this. She'd filed a claim with the county that the easement had been abandoned and that the HOA had assumed control of the road for security purposes. It would take weeks to sort out through proper channels, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I cut the lock. That's when Patricia called 911, screaming about a dangerous trespasser destroying HOA property, which brought us to the current moment with two sheriff's deputies trying to process the fact that they'd been called out to arrest a federal judge for accessing his own land. Judge Henderson, the senior deputy, said carefully, "I apologize for the confusion. Can you explain the situation?" I gave them the short version while Patricia sputtered in the background about destruction of property and criminal trespass. The deputies examined my deed, made some calls, and confirmed what I already knew. The road was a public easement and the HOA had no Authority to block it, ma'am. The deputy turned to Patricia. You need to remove this gate immediately. Installing it was illegal and you could face charges for obstruction of a public right-of-way. Patricia's face turned an alarming shade of purple. This is ridiculous. I know the law. My husband is an attorney. She grabbed her phone and started furiously texting. You'll be hearing from our legal team. The deputies made her wait while they supervised the removal of the gate, but Patricia wasn't done. Over the next week I was served with a lawsuit from the HOA claiming I had violated numerous covenants and restrictions, damaged HOA property, and caused emotional distress to the board members. The lawsuit was ridiculous on its face, since again I wasn't part of the HOA, but it would still require time and money to defend. That's when I decided to look more carefully at the Rolling Hills HOA documents. What I found was interesting, very interesting. The HOA had been formed 20 years ago, but there were significant irregularities in its founding documents. The original covenants had never been properly recorded with the county. The voting procedures used to establish the HOA didn't meet state requirements, and most damning of all, there were discrepancies in the financial records that suggested funds were being misused. I recused myself from any potential case involving the HOA to avoid any appearance of impropriety, but I did what any citizen could do. I filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office and contacted several homeowners in Rolling Hills who I'd heard had issues with Patricia's reign of terror. The stories that emerged were shocking. Homeowners fined thousands of dollars for having the wrong shade of beige on their mailboxes. Elderly residents forced to appear before the board to explain why their grass was half an inch too long during a drought. A family with a disabled child threatened with liens because they installed a wheelchair ramp without getting the proper approvals, even though it was required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. One by one, homeowners came forward. A forensic audit revealed that Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, disguising them as administrative costs. The HOA's attorney, who happened to be Patricia's brother-in-law, had been billing at rates far above market value for routine work. Board elections had been rigged for years, with Patricia counting the ballots herself and destroying any evidence of opposition. When the subpoenas started arriving, the HOA board members began to panic. Patricia's inner circle, once so loyal, started distancing themselves. Board members resigned in droves, each one providing statements about Patricia's autocratic control and questionable practices. The woman who had terrorized a neighborhood for 7 years was watching her empire crumble in real time. Patricia tried to maintain her composure, showing up to board meetings in her signature visor and acting as if nothing was wrong, but the cracks were showing. Her hands shook as she called meetings to order. Her voice cracked when she read the treasurer's report, and when process servers showed up at her door with federal documents, her neighbors reported hearing sounds of hysteria from inside her usually pristine colonial. The case moved with surprising speed. The State Attorney General's office, working with federal authorities due to mail and wire fraud allegations, built an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had the HOA been improperly formed, but Patricia had been systematically defrauding homeowners for years. The misuse of funds alone totaled over $200,000. On a bright Thursday morning, the courtroom was packed with Rolling Hills residents. Patricia sat at the defendant's table, her visor nowhere to be seen, dressed in a conservative suit that couldn't hide the panic in her eyes. Her brother-in-law attorney had withdrawn from the case, citing conflicts of interest, leaving her with a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the scope of the charges. The judge, a colleague of mine from the district court, reviewed the findings methodically. The HOA's formation had violated state law. The covenants were invalid. The elections were fraudulent. The financial crimes were extensive and deliberate. With each point, Patricia seemed to shrink further into her chair. When the judge reached his decision, the courtroom held its breath. This court finds that the Rolling Hills Homeowners Association was never legally constituted and is hereby dissolved. All liens, fines, and assessments are voided. Furthermore, Patricia Thornfield is found guilty of wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. The gavel came down with finality. The courtroom erupted in cheers from homeowners who had suffered under Patricia's regime for years, but the judge wasn't finished. Mrs. Thornfield, you are hereby sentenced to 48 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $237,000 to the affected homeowners. Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Gasping for air, she turned to look at the gallery, searching for supporters, but found only the faces of people she had tormented for years. As the bailiffs approached with handcuffs, she finally broke, sobbing uncontrollably as they led her away.